Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome to this video where we are going to explore one of the most subjective questions in the tabletop wargaming hobby, and that is, what makes a game good? Now, there is no shortage of war games out there. Even if you were to limit yourself to just one genre like sci-fi or historical or fantasy, you will still find more games than you could play in a year, even if you tried to play a different one every single week. So with the sheer volume of games out there, how do we decide which ones to try out, which ones to invest in, which ones to give a miss? What makes us love this sci-fi game, but not that one? Why does this rank and flank game hit the spot while that one over there misses the mark? And why do we gravitate to skirmish games over larger games or vice versa? I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but I sure have recently, wondering why do I play the games that I do? Since I've started the channel, I've had a chance to play a lot more often, and many different types of games, and I've started to wonder, why is it that I enjoy some more than others? And I really wanted to know because when I was doing one of my podcast interviews, one of my guests referred to something he called tabletop gaming ADHD. That is to say, every game looks fun, every game looks interesting, and you'll buy into every single game that you see, demo, test, or play even once. And then soon your pile of shame is big enough to ski down. So I've started doing some thinking about what games I really tend to gravitate to, and was wondering if maybe that has some kind of resonance with some of you. So as I looked at all the games that I've played, not just played a demo, but built, painted, played more than one game, put a little bit of effort into, I came to seeing tabletop games as having three core elements that make a game what it is. And those three things are the lore or the setting, the rule set, and the models. Now, there are a couple other essential elements of gaming that have an impact on the game, and that's cost and community. So as far as community, friends may introduce you to new games that otherwise you never would have discovered. They'll help you get into it, they'll help you through the slumps, and of course, without anyone to play against, your game time is going to be rather limited, especially if there's no solo rule set or ability to play the game by yourself. So no question that community plays a big role in what games we play. But I want to look at a game not necessarily in a vacuum, but I want to look at the game on its own two legs. A great game is still a great game, even if there's only a small community. While a massive community may mean that a game was great at one point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it still is. It could just be gaming momentum. Then, of course, as I mentioned, there's also the question of cost. Few of us can afford to play every single game, build every single army, and buy every single model that we would like. So that does affect what games you play and what you don't, but that doesn't necessarily affect the quality of the game by itself. So what I want to look at here is if money was no issue and community was no issue, but time still was. Because, I mean, honestly, if time, money, and community were no issue, I'd play everything, and I'm not even kidding. But if the only limitation you have is time, which game would you pick? What makes a game worth playing? Now, before going any further, I want to state up front that this is not a ranking video where I look at lots and lots of different games and assign them on that S to F scale. This is a very, very subjective question. I'm also not here to argue that one game is the quote-unquote perfect or nearly perfect game, because there's so much variety that I don't think any one game could adequately cover it all. Instead, I'm wondering if different games scratch different itches. For example, I played Games Workshop games pretty exclusively and religiously for a couple decades, and then something changed, and I slowly gravitated over to one-page rules. And after playing one-page rules for a couple years, I've been quite happy with how it scratches the itch for full-size, like regiment and squad-based games, but I'm suddenly finding that OPR skirmish just isn't quite hitting the right spot for me. Or when it comes to rank and flank, I find that there are elements of OPR regiments that I like, but there's elements of Kings of War that I like better. And while I initially cut my teeth on rank and flank playing the old Warhammer Fantasy, The rebirth of the old world didn't quite hit the way fantasy did when I played it back in my teens, and I was really hoping that it would. And I'll bet many of you are the same. You like this game for this reason, but that game for those reasons. That's what I want to explore here. Why is that? So let's go back to those 3 facets of a war game and dive into them a little bit deeper. Lore, rules, and models. Let's start off with lore, or setting. Has anybody here ever started playing a game or building an army specifically because of the story behind it? In fact, I would say that this is at the heart of the rule of cool. I would think that a tabletop game without a setting or a backstory is going to have a hard time finding players, because without a setting or a backstory, why should I take the time to learn your rules and build your models? Now, of course, there are examples. If it's a game system that is meant for you to put into whatever IP or whatever setting you want, okay. But still, if you don't have any kind of lore, or if you're just borrowing someone else's, that hits a little differently. The point here is, what's the motivation? Why do you want to play these rules? Why do you want to put models on the table? What's the story you're trying to tell? Even if you're playing a competitive game, the motivation is to have a game that's fair, that's balanced, and that tests the tactics and the wit and maybe the luck of your opponent. Now, historic war games, they draw in players who want to explore warfare in ancient history, or medieval combat, or the Napoleonic Wars, or World War II. There is a very, very strong baked-in narrative for playing historic games. Games Workshop has built an immense sci-fi world for 40K. And as I mentioned before, how many of you who play 40K picked your army because of the backstory, the lore, the fluff? There was something about a particular army that spoke to you. I mean, that's how I ended up with my Alpha Legion and my Iron Warriors armies. After reading about them in Black Library novels, I just had to play them. And that was before seeing any stats, any rules, or anything like that. After reading what made that army what it was, I had to have it. Another example of how lore can be a very powerful lure to get into a particular game is to look at Trench Crusade and how suddenly it has caught a lot of people's interest. The idea of combining medieval crusades with World War I trench warfare, it certainly caught my attention. They found a way to take 2 time periods that you would normally be pretty hard-pressed to unite, but they came up with an intriguing story to explain how it was possible. Now, I'm sure the lore has its flaws, and the game and the lore is still very, very early. So there is unfortunately time for them to make mistakes and screw it all up, but there's also time for them to make it even better. But just as 40K found a way to take melee combat and make it a major part of futuristic warfare, where you have plasma guns and faster than light travel, Trench Crusade has found a way to match sword and shield with trench warfare, rifles, machine guns, and mortars. They've taken 2 things that normally would be absolutely anachronistic to each other, and they put them together. Then if we move on to a game like Brutality. If any of you have watched Let's Talk Tabletop, Scott's the creator of that game, and his goal was to create a game that wasn't bound by any particular setting or genre. But in order to do that, he still had to have a setting. So the backstory to his game is that the goddess Ishtar has created a sort of gladiatorial arena in a pocket dimension where she essentially kidnaps the greatest warriors across time and space to fight for her amusement. And when Scott came to the kingdom to give me a demo game of it, I used soldiers from A Song of Ice and Fire, right, from Game of Thrones, and he used models from Predator. We had medieval versus super duper futuristic and alien. Then you just need to look at how many beloved IPs and franchises have been turned into war games, because players want to have their own battles and adventures in that world. And here I'm talking about things like Halo, Star Wars, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the Marvel Universe. All of these have great potential because there's a story, there's a background, there's a world that people want to play in. The game simply gives you the doorway to enter that world as a participant, rather than when you're watching a movie or something and you're just a passive viewer. Now, while we're on this topic of setting, I would argue that setting is not the same as narrative. It's one thing to play the Romans in a historical war game like Hail Caesar. It's another thing to play the Romans at the Battle of Cannae fighting Hannibal. So another important aspect of gaming lore that might attract or, entice players is whether or not there is a narrative canon of some sort that players, quote unquote, have to abide by, or on the flip side, have the ability to join in. As I just mentioned, historical games, they've got this in spades because the whole point of them is to refight, reenact, re-experience these battles and wars of the past. So you could play bolt action in any theater of World War II as a setting, or you could play the Battle of Stalingrad or the D-Day landings. If we jump over into science fiction, you can go to Warhammer 30K and you can fight battles set during the Horus Heresy, or you could play the Titan Death, the Drop Site Massacre, or the Siege of Terra. So if you were to look at the games you play more often than others, is there some kind of a pattern to lore and setting? Would you play a game that had a fantastic setting, but maybe the rules weren't so great? Do you gravitate more to science fiction, to fantasy, to history, to steampunk, to post-apocalyptic? Do you like to play already popular licensed IPs? What is it that draws you in terms of lore and setting? And, as I mentioned, have you played a game where the rules weren't great, but you just really wanted to be in that universe? So now, let's talk a bit about rules. Now here's a question for you. What comes first in designing a good game, the lore or the rules? Or is it maybe like a chicken-egg thing? You could say, I want a game that plays like this, but then you really need to come up with a setting for it. A game without a setting is just a list of policies, basically. You become HR. Or, on the flip side, you could say, let's make a game that combines cavemen and space travel. And then you've got the idea for a setting, but you have to work out rules that make such a thing possible and workable. And I'm sure that both of them have spawned plenty of very successful games. My question here is, when can a solid rule set make up for lore that may be lacking or may just be kind of vanilla? And on the flip side, when have you played a game in an interesting setting, but the rules were too convoluted, too simple, too complex, or just flat broken? The way I see it, rule sets are supposed to be there to balance the experience of the game between 2 points, aligning with the lore and facilitating gameplay. If the game comes from an established IP, the rules have a very tricky job of trying to make characters feel on the tabletop like they do in the lore, but at the same time, they can't break the game entirely. And when you have IP like Marvel or Star Wars, it's going to be tricky to make sure that a character like Darth Vader or Thanos feels as powerful as they're supposed to be, but they don't completely break the game. That you can't just put Darth Vader as your single army and he can wipe out endless squads of rebels or something like that. In earlier editions of the Horus Heresy, you kind of had this problem with the Primarchs. You put them on the table and they pretty much broke the game. Now, you weren't supposed to be able to bring them on the table unless you had big armies. But the only thing you could really do was to bring your own Primarch, or try and shoot the enemy Primarch with a Titan or something that had a destroyer weapon and hope that you rolled that wonderful 6 on the destroyer table. Otherwise, that Primarch is just going to stroll through your army, tearing it apart like a tornado in a trailer park. Now, at the same time, rules not only have to try and make the lore come alive on the tabletop, but the rules need to facilitate gameplay and ensure that player choices and actions are a significant part of the game. A great example of including rules that totally break with lore or reality, but are important to facilitating gameplay, can be seen in games like 40K or one-page rules, where a roll of 6 is always a success, at least in one-page rules to hit and in 40K to wound. When Games Workshop released the Knight Titan models more than, I think, almost a decade ago, they were almost unbeatable. At the time, GW still used the strength and toughness chart to determine whether a weapon or an attack actually wounded its target. And players had to roll based on the strength of the weapon they used versus the toughness of the knight. And since knights were titans, they had a toughness value that was so high that most weapons simply couldn't wound it. Now that makes sense lore-wise, because it's unlikely that a guardsman with a puny little lasgun is going to bring down a titan just by constantly shooting it. But that also means that if a knight player plays against a guardsman, they spend the first turn or two focusing fire on the few units, the tanks, the artillery, the heavy weapon squads that can actually hurt the knight. And then for the rest of the game, the knight player can do whatever they want, and the guardsman literally can't stop them. So in 8th edition, Games Workshop changed the mechanics of the wound roll to a different system, in which a 6 pretty much always caused a wound. It made it highly unlikely, but still possible, that enough guardsmen could now bring down a knight just with las guns. One-page rules also adopted that concept, making a roll of 6 always a success, no matter what. Whether you're talking about shooting, whether you're talking about morale, whether you're talking about defense rolls, a 6 trumped all modifiers, everything. A halfling could get picked up by a dragon just about to get bitten in half, but if the halfling rolled enough 6s to save, the dragon, I guess, chips a tooth on the halfling's spinal column or something crazy like that. So when a rule set goes too far from lore, it becomes dry and formulaic. But if it goes too much the other way, armies or units get imbalanced to the point of completely breaking the game. See also Eldar in 7th edition 40k. So in addition to trying to balance flavor with practicality, rule sets also have to walk the fine line between complexity and simplicity. Too much simplicity in a wargame basically becomes checkers with some really expensive pieces, and there's not much of a reason to invest in different armies because everything feels the same. I have had many viewers actually tell me that's how they have felt again about one-page rules. To them, it was just too simple, and therefore not the amount of room for tactics and list building that they would like. Now, of course, coming from something like 40k or Age of Sigmar, everything feels too simplistic, almost without exception. But on the other hand, one of the problems that perpetually plagues games like Warhammer 40k is it keeps becoming more and more complex. Previous editions got to the point where you needed a rulebook, your codex, several FAQs for both the rulebook and the codex, as well as other supplements in order to play specific detachments or sub-factions or what have you. You would have more books and paper strewn about you than an accountant during tax season. So when deciding whether a game is quote-unquote good or not, obviously the rules play a big part. Do you like the mechanics? Do you like how they work? Are they complex enough to make the game interesting but not so simple as to make the game boring? There's also how the game includes elements of chance. Unlike a game like chess, where all rules are set from the beginning, war games usually include some kind of probability of failure that's outside of your control. You can mitigate it, but you can't control it. So most games use dice, and many of these use D6 dice. But I'm noticing more games are now experimenting with, for example, D10s, because it's much easier to calculate percentages. It gives you a bigger range for spreading out skill levels of various units. D6 systems have to achieve this with rerolls, which slow down the game, because you've only got so many sides on a D6. Now, personally, I think D6 systems should all convert to D12, and I hope one day to make a video going into detail about why. But the biggest reason is that it's easily done, well, biggest two reasons, easily done and literally doubles the range available to assign as stats to units, and it'll give the game more variety. But then you have games like Malifaux that don't use dice at all. They use a deck of cards, serving as both a very unique method of adding chance to the game, but also adds to the lore. Since the setting for Malifaux is a Wild Western theme, it's kind of cool that you're playing with a deck of cards like you're playing poker in a saloon. So rule sets not only are foundational to a game, without rules you don't have a game, but games have to walk that fine line between being different without being gimmicky. And I don't mean this as an insult, but I do mean it as kind of gimmicky. If you look at a game like Conquest, Last Argument of Kings, one of the things they do in their rules is you always want to roll low. So instead of good units having low target numbers that you're trying to beat, for example, roll 2 or higher on a d6, they do it the opposite. You're trying to roll under the target number, so good units have high stats. You want to roll 5 or below. To me, that's kind of gimmicky, because what does it matter whether you're trying to roll higher than a 2 or lower than a 5? It's still the same probability. It's still going to translate the exact same in terms of statistics. To me, that's gimmicky. Whereas Malifaux, using cards instead of dice, you could say that's a gimmick, but it's also a clever new way of doing chance in the game. There are other elements to rules that can define a game, and while some people prefer that way, others it might drive away. For example, look at a game like BattleTech that uses a hex-based system rather than measuring movement in inches. This is similar to, for example, Warhammer Underworlds, but any game where it moves almost like pieces on a board in a board game rather than having complete range of motion within a limit of so many inches of movement. You have other games like Marvel Crisis Protocol or Saga that are a bit of a mix. They have measuring tools that define movement. So it's free movement, but it's not just here's how many inches the character can move, it's the character can move up to this stick size, and they can attack up to this stick size, which you could argue is just a fancy way of using the tape measure, but it facilitates things because you're not constantly having to measure things out. You've got your 3 units of measurement, and away you go. Or you have games like Space Weirdos, which have 1 unit of measurement, a single stick. I can't remember exactly how long it is. I think it's 3 or 4 inches. And everything is measured in how many sticks. So this particular unit can move 2, it can shoot 3, it can charge 2, so on and so forth. Is that gimmicky? I think it rides the fence, but it also brings a little more simplicity. So the overall point here is that rule sets define a game, and they make it unique to the same degree as lore does. Take a look at, for example, one-page rules. It was designed to copy and simplify Warhammer 40K. So there's a lot that looks and feels very similar. But just by using alternating activations instead of the familiar you go, I go of 40K, one-page rules is a very different game. Likewise, one-page rules copied the armies used in 40K as well. But over the years, they have adjusted those armies, changed stats, changed weapons, added entirely new factions and armies of their own. And so once again, if anyone has played 40K and then plays one-page rules, it will feel very similar, but there's enough difference that the game is now unique and it's different on its own. So just like we did with the games you play and looking at their lore, if you were to look at the games you play most, do you notice they share similar rule set elements? Do you tend to skirmish or do you tend to squad-based? Do you prefer alternating activations? You go, then I go. Or do you prefer something more random like in bolt action where you could go twice and then your opponent goes once and then you go 3 times and then they go twice because you're just pulling dice out of a bag? Maybe you prefer fleet games, whether it's in space or on the oceans, rather than playing games with boots on the ground. Or would you find that you like to play one game because it does this mechanic really, really well, but you play that game because it does this other mechanic a whole lot better? Do you have a game for every itch, or do you try and find the one game that scratches the majority of them and just kind of stick with that one? And even if you prefer that one game version, how much does lore affect which one you pick versus rule set? Maybe you'll start to see a pattern. Who knows? So having said all that, let's take a look at the last element of a war game that I think is essential to determining its quality and its success, and that's the models. The models, in a way, bind together the rule set and the lore, because the design brings in elements of lore, but how you use that model obviously is determined by the rule set. And I think I can prove it with a couple questions here, just how important models are to picking a game. Have you ever, A, bought a model just because it looked really good, or on the flip side, didn't buy a model because it looked really stupid? Or B, did you ever buy a model or a unit because its rules were just too good to pass up, which is also known as the auto-include? I recall back in the 7th edition of 40K, I bought a box of Necron Tomb Blades so that I could run the Decurion detachment. I never really liked Tomb Blades. I'd never bought them before. I never had any desire to buy them before. I didn't even really like how they looked. But if I wanted a snowball's chance of surviving past turn 2 in 7th edition, I had to play a Decurion detachment. And the detachment required at least 1 unit of Tomb Blades. Whereas at the same time, currently in one-page rules, I have a Chivalrous Kingdoms army because I really like the look of the models from the Song of Ice and Fire game, even though that army absolutely sucks. It can't win anything. So the models, again, they're this interesting bridge between lore and rules. So there's quite a bit to think about when we talk about the models for a particular game. There are still lots of games that quote unquote require you to use their models. Now, I use that term very flexibly. Some companies use their models as basically gatekeepers. Take, for example, Conquest, Last Argument of Kings. I love fantasy rank and flank. I have plenty of fantasy rank and flank armies in 28 and 32 millimeter. But Conquest uses 38 millimeter scale. Now, since it's a rank and flank game, using a small scale would give an unfair advantage if I were to proxy in my 28 millimeter army into a game of Conquest. I'd be able to fit more units in the same amount of space. And there aren't that many companies that make fantasy models in 38 millimeter unless I want to start 3D printing all of them. So if you want to play Conquest, you must buy and use their models. Now, don't get me wrong, the sculpts are beautiful. I'm not saying that their models are crap. What I am saying, though, is one of the reasons I haven't dived into Conquest more, even though I really like the rules and I really like the models, I'm hesitant because I'd be starting from scratch and would have to buy and paint a lot of minis, and there's not a massive Conquest community where I play. So I'm hesitant to spend hundreds of dollars and dozens, perhaps hundreds of hours building and painting an entirely new army I might not ever get to play. That would be a negative example of how models affect whether I play or don't play a particular game. Now, you can always proxy, and in the comfort of your own home and your local gaming store, you can absolutely substitute whatever the heck you want. But at the same time, we got to talk about when you can't, or when you shouldn't, or when you choose not to. And there are some games that don't necessarily gatekeep with their models the way that 40K would in a tournament setting or Conquest does with game scale. But it's still important to use the established models for a game. So, for example, I recently discovered this Quar's War. And why on earth would you play that game if you weren't going to use the models? That's half the draw of the game. Part of the game is the unique appearance of these models. Picture World War I with anteaters drawn like Saturday morning cartoons. The aesthetic of the models is a big part of what makes the game appealing. So, of course, you could proxy, and that's a great idea for testing out a game to see if you like it. But for some games, especially ones based on established or licensed IP, the models are a big reason why you play. Very similar to the allure of playing in a specific lore. If I play a Star Wars game, and I want to use Star Wars minis because that's the point of playing in the Star Wars universe. I mean, just imagine putting out your Legion or your Shatterpoint army and saying, I don't have a Han Solo, so I'm going to proxy Commissar Yarrick here. Just no. That breaks with the lore, that breaks the, the illusion, the immersion, the narrative. So, no. To test out, sure. But if you're still using Commissar Yarrick 2 years from now in your Shatterpoint army, no. So you've got those games where for one reason or another, you have to play a specific model set in order to enjoy that game. At the other end of the spectrum, though, there is a growing number of model agnostic games, and increasingly, a lot of the new games that I'm seeing hitting the market have to go model agnostic simply because people don't want to have to build and paint another army just to play. Whereas if you tell them, look, take the models you've already got, but test them out in our rule set and play in our lore universe, they're finding a bit more success. So I think these model agnostic games have a huge advantage over games that require a set of minis for a pretty obvious reason. For example, I just mentioned Star Wars. When Scott from Let's Talk Tabletop played that demo game of Brutality with me, we played a second game of his game Mass Brutality, which is Brutality's the skirmish, Mass Brutality is the larger unit-based one. And for that one, I used the same Song of Ice and Fire minis that I had, but he brought in models from Star Wars Legion. So with model agnostic games, you can take the rule of cool to the max and field whatever minis you want, including minis from other tabletop wargames. This is why I think the interplay between lore, rules, and models is so interesting and so dynamic. You can have a great game, but I think you need two of them. And at the same time, I think it's almost impossible to create an amazing game with all three. Now, some might disagree and say, for example, they love the 40K universe, they love the models, they love the rule set. It scratches the itch. And if it does, perfect. That's why I said this is a very subjective topic, and I'm not here to tell you you can't like this game or that game. But let's talk about others who would look at 40K and say full points on the lore. I think it's a fantastic world. I've read tons of Black Library stuff, almost finishing up with the Horus Heresy. It's got a great lore and a great setting. Also, full points on the models if we don't look at the price tag. You can look back at all of the videos I've done, and while I criticize a lot about Games Workshop, I have never said that their models suck. But over time, the cost and the rules are what turned me off. And I wonder how many folks who love 40K don't like this or that about the rules, but they fall into the sunk cost fallacy. They've been playing for so long, they've spent so much money that they don't want to abandon a game, even if the rules are starting to get kind of annoying. I'm not saying that everyone playing 40K is a phony, not at all. But I just wonder how often momentum and sunk cost will push people to continue playing a game that maybe they don't enjoy as much as they used to. Who knows? Different topic for a different video. Now, if we shift over from 40K to looking at one-page rules, I really like the rules, and you really can't do better with the models because you can use any models you want, including your models from 40K. But personally, I'm finding the lore of one-page rules a little bit lacking. By basing itself on 40K, but now trying not to just be a 40K knockoff, OPR's in a bit of a bind with their lore. They have to stick to certain larger themes and larger concepts in their lore, but they want to mix it up so that they're not just carbon copying 40K, and that's like trying to cook a different meal but using the exact same ingredients that a different chef did. So they're trying to make a particular soup, and you using the same ingredients are going to say, I'm going to make a totally different soup. I'm not sure how well that's going to work. Or you could look at a game like Malifaux, which I think has a fascinating setting, and the models look fantastic, even though they're an absolute nightmare to build. I mean, really unnecessarily complicated to build. But as far as the rule set, I found Malifaux felt a bit too much like playing Yu-Gi-Oh!, where the level of card building and reacting and triggering and stuff like that got a little bit too complicated. So I was willing to play Malifaux because it had 2 out of the 3. Great lore, nice models. The rules, though, didn't quite scratch the itch how I hoped for them. Then you've got games like Halo, Star Wars, or Marvel, where they've got the lore, they've got the models, and in many cases, I think they have a pretty good rule set. So you might say, haha, there it is. There's all 3. Yes, as long as you're happy only playing in that particular IP. I tried out Halo Flashpoint. It was a lot of fun. They very successfully brought the computer game or the console game onto the tabletop. The models looked great. The game was a ton of fun. The rules were effective, but you're only playing within Halo. So unless you want to limit yourself to one IP, you're not going to be able to play that for everything. So they provide all 3, but only in a very specific and limited scope. So I'm wondering if we as gamers, even if we do it subconsciously, look at how these 3 elements interact, combined with the potential gaming community, and that's how we make our decisions of whether to join or not. For some people, lore is more important than rules. For some, model is more important than lore. Any one of them can be the initial hook that you might hear the story behind it and say, well, I want to try a game in that setting. That sounds like fun. Or you might see a model and say, I've got to have that in my collection, and then maybe I'll actually try out the game sometime too. But I would argue that without at least 2 of these, and the third one at the very least being meh or okay, you'll probably end up putting that game aside. I don't think one of those categories is enough to maintain long-term interest in a game. But what do you think? What do you guys look for in a game? What patterns do you notice in the games that you play? What do you think is the most important of the 3? The lore, the rules, the models, or is there something else? Should price, should be community be included among those 3? Should it maybe be 5 categories instead of 3? Let me know down in the comments. And until next time, keep your dice on the table.